Good evening, everybody. See, the skies are crying tonight. The Gemara doesn't have very kind things to say about somebody who is delinquent or totally neglects eulogizing a Talmid Chacham. And here we're going to try to share a few ideas and some thoughts, not only about a Talmid Chacham, not only about a great Torah scholar, but about somebody who had such an incredible impact on the Jewish world at large. It's easy to say on the extended and extensive Orthodox world, but the truth is that it was far beyond that. Rabbi Wein was born in 1932 in Chicago. He was an American-born giant. At 11 years old, though he was still in a public school, he left school and he went to study in the yeshiva of Skokie, the Jewish Hebrew Theological College. And he was much younger than all the students around him. But because he was clearly a genius, he was able to keep up with them and become the top student in a very short time. I don't want to give a biographical sketch about him tonight. Time doesn't allow it. We have minutes at 7:25, and I intend to keep to that time. There's a story that's told about someone, Rav Shimon Schwab. He once came to the Chofetz Chaim, or he came to Chaim Ozer Bajensky, and the Chofetz Chaim, Rav Schwab had just been in Radin visiting the Chofetz Chaim. And when he came to the Chaim Ozer Bajensky in Vilna, the Rav Chaim Ozer said, "What do you say about the Chofetz Chaim?" So Rabbi Schwab, who was a yeshiva bacher at the time, said, Rav Schwab, who was a yeshiva bacher at the time, said, "What can I say? Thank you. What can I say about the tzaddik hador? What can I say about the righteous person, the tzaddik of the generation?" And Rabbi Chaim Ozer responded by saying, "Yes, people know he's the tzaddik of the generation, but people don't know that he's also the greatest Talmid Chacham, the greatest sage of the generation." I think in a similar vein, we can say about Rabbi Wein that he was so well known for his mastery of history and for his oratory skills and for his ability to be able to interact with people across the spectrum of Judaism and even outside of Judaism, that people forget what a great Torah scholar he was. While in Skokie, he learned from some of the great sages who came yet from Europe. And if you've read the articles about him in the last week, almost 2 weeks now since his passing, you'll know that those Rabbeim hardly spoke any English. And the students hardly spoke any Yiddish. And somehow they made themselves understood and got across to them. And Rabbi Wein, throughout his life, quoted and spoke about these teachers more than what he taught them, the impact that they left on him. And he used to say, and this was repeated constantly, that the Talmud says that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the great Rebbe, used to say he reached the levels that he did because he saw his teacher Rabbi Meir from the back. Had he seen him up front, he could have been so much greater. The job here tonight is not to go into the explanation of that Gemara. But Rabbi Wein said, "I merited to see Lithuanian Jewry from the back because I saw those great teachers, those great Talmid Chachamim, those great Balei Midos, people who had such sterling character, and they inspired him. They inspired him to teach Torah. They inspired him to commit himself to the Jewish people, as well as the well-known story with Rabbi Herzog Herzog, who at that time was the chief rabbi in Israel. And after the war, he came to Skokie, and they met him at the airport. Rabbi Wein remembers he was an 11-year-old, maybe a little bit old, maybe he was a teenager, maybe he was 13, and he went to greet Rabbi Herzog at the airport, and then he came to the yeshiva and he gave a Talmudic discourse, and afterwards, Rabbi Herzog said that he just came back from Rome. And in Rome, he had spoken with the Pope, and we know there were thousands and thousands of Jewish children that were taken, not kidnapped, they were given over by Jewish people to watch them, understanding that they would give them back after the war. And they didn't. And Rabbi Herzog said that he went to the Pope and asked for the children back. Now, even though, according to the accounts that I read this week, which I didn't know before, later on, while the Pope did give some children back, but when Rabbi Herzog visited him, he said, no, there are children. They've been baptized, and he wouldn't give them back. And Rabbi Wein said, Rabbi Herzog just broke down crying. He put his head down on the stender, and he cried, and he cried, and he cried. And Rabbi Wein said he had never seen somebody cry like that over the lost children. And he said, I wasn't able to do anything for them. But you can. You have to do for world Jewry. You have to be committed Jews. You have to live your life for the Jewish people. And then, eventually when he left, everybody came around to shake his hand and to get a bracha from him. And Rabbi Herzog turned to young Berel Wein and said, did you understand the message? Did you get it? And Rabbi Wein said, yes. And he said at that moment, he was committed to committing and dedicating his life to the Jewish people. And that he did. His father-in-law, Rabbi Berel Wein, spent a number of years as a young orphan living with the Chofetz Chaim. And when Rabbi Wein finally was headed off to America, and he was going to become a Rav, a rabbi eventually in Detroit, he had many great sons. Rabbi Wein was his son-in-law. When Chofetz Chaim said goodbye to him, he said to Rabbi Wein, "Geh reden zu Yidden, go talk to Jews." And Rabbi Wein would repeat that story often, and that was the teaching, that was the directive that Rabbi Wein himself took for his life. Geh reden zu Yidden, whether it was spoken word, the written word. Other people have made lots of audio recordings. He was the first one to make so many. So many. The competition with Victor Miller, I don't remember who came first, who came later, doesn't really matter. And what I've been reading a lot during the last week, and there was something that really overwhelmed me with a sense of joy and sadness at the same time. And that is, when I would read an article from so-and-so and read about his relationship with Rabbi Wein, and he wrote what he had learned and about the relationship that he had, I said to him, oh, I learned that too. I got that from Rabbi Wein. And I had a relationship with him. And then another one would write something. Every article that I read, except for the ones written by immediate family who spoke about family interaction, every article that I read, I said, I learned that from Rabbi Wein too. And I was so filled with joy that even though I did not see him regularly, the last time I saw him was 2 years ago when he came to speak to a group of us from Aish who went to Aish Torah. He was close to 90. He made the effort to come and speak. I would call him a couple of times a year just to wish him a good yontif. He was always glad to hear from me, as I'm sure he was from hundreds or thousands of people around the world. There were always short phone calls where I would just thank him for what he's done for me and what he's done for us. And I would encourage him to keep on going because the world still needs him. And he was so gracious and so kind, and he gave his time to everybody else until just about the end, when he was no longer capable of the last few weeks. He lived for the Jewish people. I'm going to finish by 7:02 because Rabbi Goldberg, I'm giving you equal time. So I'm going to have to finish by 7:25. So I want to share with you, first of all, our personal relationship. Apparently in the 1980s, Rabbi Wein had come to speak at a dinner for Yeshiva Torah Chaim here in town. I had never met him, but by the time of 1988, 89 rolled around, I had heard him many times because I started listening to his cassette tapes, Olav Shalom, if you remember what those are, right? And I learned so much from him, and he made Jewish history come alive. More than making it come alive, and made it acceptable and usable and user-friendly and things you can learn from, he taught, and he made us feel a crucial, vital lesson, and that is, you are a player in that history. Every Jew is a player in that history. It's not some story from the past. I don't know anybody else, as much as Rabbi Wein, who are teaching history and teaching other things, constantly quoted from the books of the prophets and from David HaMelech, and would constantly say, that's a lesson that we learned from him. He says the Torah is a living book. The Nevi'im are living. They're teaching us. They're us. We have to learn their lessons. And unfortunately, that's a learning that has really gone by the wayside. And Rabbi Wein, in many ways, revived it. He saw the present through the eyes of the Torah. He saw the present through the eyes of Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu and Yecheskel and etc., all the great prophets. He was humble. He never put on rabbinic garb. You know, he would wear the Chicago Cubs jacket, but like just not even a suit jacket. Just dressed simply during the week. He was so unassuming, and he so was not full of himself. I have a friend and he always had some wise insight. Aside from calling the Skokie Yeshiva, as I was saying before, and when there are things going on in the world, whether here in America or in Eretz Yisrael, which were to me were so confusing. And you'd hear one group of rabbanim say this and one group of rabbanim say that, or in Israel you'd hear the different politicians say this and that. If I wanted clarity on an issue, an unbiased opinion of what was going on, just seeing it, not taking some, he was the one I would call. And I called him numerous times to ask him, what do you think of this? Or is what this person saying real, or is he just making up a story? And he was always, the conversations were always short, to the point. A friend of mine who had studied in his yeshiva after he got married once said to Rabbi Wein, he said, I buy my wife flowers for Shabbos. He says, but the flowers die so quickly. I buy it for her. I want it to be around. They die. And, what kind of, And Rabbi Wein said, you're making a mistake. You're not investing in flowers. You're investing in your marriage. And every time that you buy flowers, it's another investment in your marriage. And yet the flowers grow up, and then you're ready to invest in your marriage again. He spoke many times about the importance of being aware of things. About the first day that he was a lawyer, 20 years old, 21 years old, was the youngest to ever pass the bar in Illinois. And he went out to his first day of work. And when he left, his father, who was a rabbi, Rabbi Zeb Wein, said to him, Berel, don't forget to daven mincha. And it was in the middle of the winter. And Berel, he said himself, that was insulting. Me, the yeshiva bacher, who has smicha, who just learning in yeshiva, and even when he was in college and in law school, he still went to the yeshiva. I'm going to forget. But he said the first day on the job, he was working and he had this file to take care of and this place to run to, and all of a sudden, time came and he had missed mincha. And he saw the wisdom of his father. And I don't think he ever, I can't say for sure, but he never, in a situation like that, missed mincha again. Because it was constantly always on his mind. And even from his younger years when he was married, sometimes he would come home after a frustrating job and he didn't stay. The reason that he went into law is because his father told him that the Orthodox rabbinate has no future in America and you have to make a living. And he said, you won't be able to get a job. So do something else, become a lawyer. And he did. And he was a very successful lawyer, but he didn't like working in the field of law and he saw too much crookedness. He said he couldn't deal with it because he didn't see yashrus, he didn't see straightforwardness, and honesty. And he was a man who was. So he left it and he went into the rabbinate, again, not giving his whole history, but he said when he was a young father, sometimes he would come home and he would be all agitated and everything, and he would be like that when he walked into the house. And he said, one day I realized, how could I do that? Like, what did they do at home to warrant my being impatient with them because I had a hard day, which is something we teach in all marriage classes, and then hopefully try to live up to ourselves. And he said he sat in the car before he went into the house, and he thought about it, and he prepared himself for coming into a house with running children and noise. And this way, when he walked in, he was able to give them a greeting that was befitting. Just to greet his wife and his children in a proper way, in a nice way. And he taught those things to people through his own stories so many times. One of the other things that I mentioned before, that he said he saw Lithuanian journey from the back, he was the champion of Masorah. He was the champion of transmitting. Now, I'm not Lithuanian background. I have 1 ounce of Lithuanian Jewish blood in me that I know of. Only from yeshiva, so maybe by osmosis. No physical blood. But what I was able to learn from him and how he was able to transmit life in Lithuania and what Torah meant for the Lithuanian Jew, and he made it become so alive. And he was able to give the histories. He was able to bring other realms, the Hasidim and the Hungarians. He was able to explain them, but the Masorah that he gave over. And perhaps, I don't know, because you have many Rosh Yeshiva today whose teachers were from Lithuania, and they weren't in the 1930s or 40s with these great Lithuanian rabbis and lived to tell about it 60 years later and tell what life was about. He used to say that when Rabbi Mendel Kaplan, came from Lithuania, he spoke a little bit of English. He became a great teacher at Rosh Yeshiva here in America, Magashir. But he said the first day that he came, he couldn't speak to the boys. And the boys are thinking, we like the Cubs, and he likes Rava and Abaya, and we have nothing to do with it. You know what? So the next day, second day that he came into the classroom, Rabbi Wein was in high school at the time, he walks in with the Chicago Tribune. And he sits in front of the class with the Chicago Tribune. And the boys are looking at him as, he hardly speaks English, he just came off the boat, and this is how he's going to teach. And he told the boys, he says, you're going to teach me how to speak English, and I'm going to teach you how to read a newspaper. Meaning, we don't mean how to read a newspaper. What are you supposed to take out? What are the lessons that the Almighty is sending us? And you see certain things happening in the world. How do you interpret them? Most people, they have no idea. They're so short-sighted. They have no idea how to interpret them. They don't know what it means. They go and they get upset and they get happy, not knowing what are the ramifications. He said a Mendel Kaplan taught him how to read a newspaper. He taught the Jewish people who he came across. He was here, by the way, after he spoke at the yeshiva, and after I started hearing his tapes, in 1989, I brought him out here for the first time. I'd never met him. And he gave 2 talks after him. I had a lunch and learn downtown with 30 or 40 business people. And then at night, he spoke to about 160 people. That was the first major speaker that I had brought out then. It was a big deal. And he just blew the roof off the place. I remember most of what he said that night, and I recorded it and then sent it out. It was my first fundraiser that I sent out. Had actually a very good return. But when somebody in Florida, where he heard it, he had been in Florida years earlier, spoke to Rabbi Wein, and they thought it was so impactful that he made 50,000 copies of the tape and mailed them out to Jews in Florida because they wanted him. That person who had heard it wanted people to hear Rabbi Berel Wein's message. When he spoke about different leaders, when he spoke about different streams, it wasn't with a bias. It was telling things how it was, how he saw it, and bringing out the greatness. He taught us that he constantly taught us, you're part of the story, you're part of the Jewish people, you're a part of the history. The world was created for you. From Weinberg used to teach us all the time. And remember, you have to play a role. Live up to it. Play your role. Understand that you're not a side character. The same way that Jews in the last 2,000 years have been part of that story, you are part of the story too. And I'll close with well-known story where one time, it's told different ways, I heard him tell it more than once, where he was sitting on during one of the intifadas, he was sitting on an airplane, and this hoity-toity lady, non-Jewish woman, was sitting next to him. He was sitting there reading a newspaper, and she was doing whatever she was doing. He was on the page, with all the problems that were going on in Israel, and the lady turned to him and said, very nicely, this is all your fault. And he said, no, ma'am, it's not my fault, but it's because of me. He understood the role of the Jewish people. He wanted every Jew who came across to play a role in making that picture, making the role they played into being a great Jew and to raising the pride of the Jewish people and bringing honor to Hashem. His memory be a blessing. I know that as long as I have the memory, please God, and I'm able to teach, I'll be quoting him and I'll be learning to him. And thank God he left over such a magnificent legacy of writings and teachings and films that we never have to stop learning what Rabbi Wein, amongst the other things that we learn, to inspire us and to inspire future generations.
Rishus Arav, Rishus Hakal. We're gathered to honor a great man, to remember a phenomenal person. We're here to pay homage. We were also here for another important reason, and therefore, I am not going to tell you that Rabbi Wein was a pivotal author, was probably done more than anyone else in 50 years to popularize the study of Jewish history. I'm not going to tell you that if you study Torah online in any way is likely due to Rabbi Wein, who was the first person to exploit the new media and demonstrate its effectiveness as he reached a mass audience, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people. Nor am I going to tell you that Rabbi Wein could make or break a convention. One of the reasons there is no longer an OU convention on the West Coast is because Rabbi Wein in the last decade or so could no longer open the convention. When he did, some 500 people were glued to his words. No other speaker could do that. I'm not going to tell you about Rabbi Wein, the pulpit rabbi, who changed southern Florida and then changed Muncie, New York. Nor will I mention that Rabbi Wein was a Rosh Yeshiva in Muncie, founding a wonderful institution for a wide variety of students, among them my son-in-law. I will also not tell you that Rabbi Wein wrote Hebrew, halachic score, in addition to his books on Jewish history. It's also not the point to mention that Rabbi Wein played a key role in transforming Kashrus supervision in the United States. I'm surely not going to tell you that Rabbi Wein could bridge divides across the Orthodox community pretty much like no one else. Nor am I going to mention Rabbi Wein sustained Orthodox communities in many places, not just with moral support, but with hard cash that he himself raised. I must admit, I am tempted to tell you about Rabbi Wein's incomparable sense of humor. Do you remember what he said right here at Aish a few years ago, after Rabbi Meyer gave him a very generous introduction? Rabbi Wein said, "Whenever I get such a generous introduction, I can hardly wait to hear what I have to say." I must also admit that I'm tempted to tell you how Rabbi Wein illustrated the perils of stereotyping people. He was riding in a taxi together with a chassid in full regalia. Well, the driver had the radio played music. And what would the chassid understand of that? Suddenly, the chassid turns to Rabbi Wein and says, "Isn't that Mahler's Fourth Symphony?" So much for prejudging a chassid or anyone. I'm not going to tell you any of this, not just because Rabbi Wein wrote an autobiography, and you can find a lot of it in his book. The reason I'm not telling you any of this is because it's not enough to honor and eulogize a great person. If this is all we do tonight, we will all leave saying to ourselves, Rabbi Wein was indeed a great person, but I could never do all that Rabbi Wein did, or even part of it. And that is exactly the wrong way to leave an event like this. So here's what I do want to tell you about Rabbi Wein. I want to tell you this because besides everything else he did, this is the one thing that all of us can learn from Rabbi Wein. All of us can do it. We need to leave an event like this, not just in awe of a great person, but inspired to actually match one of his traits. So what I want to tell you about Rabbi Wein is that he knew how to be a friend. He modeled friendship. All of us could learn that from him. How was Rabbi Wein a friend? Here is my experience. Rabbi Wein was a listener, not distracted, not just sitting there being polite. Rabbi Wein was not rushed. Rabbi Wein once did me a great favor, but never asked for or expected anything in return. Rabbi Wein was vulnerable. He could share what he was hurting, such as after the loss of his wife. Rabbi Wein enjoyed camaraderie. Rabbi Wein could point out something great that came from something he did without turning the spotlight on himself. For example, he once said that he found it remarkable that people actually became fluent from studying Jewish history. Of course, they were studying with him via his broadcast, but for Rabbi Wein, the focus was not on him, not on his teaching. The focus was on the subject matter itself. Rabbi Wein returned phone calls. Rabbi Wein was glad to hear from you. Rabbi Wein could sustain friendships for decades. Yes, Rabbi Wein was a friend, and he modeled friendship. We cannot approach Rabbi Wein's tremendous achievements, but we too can be a friend. That we can all learn to do. That we can take away from the remarkable life of Rabbi Berel Wein, Zecher Tzaddik Livra.
While we still have a few minutes, should have invited another speaker after this. I want to point out, I was remiss because I've done this before in public. After Rabbi Wein was here in 1989, I believe I brought him out here to speak again. And then when I brought him out here, it was 1993. It was 4 years after he was here the first time. Maybe it was 1994. And we had a very nice fundraising dinner in someone's home where he came and he was the guest speaker. It was a wonderful evening. And then aside from that, he spoke to other audiences while he was here. And then the next day, many of you know this story. The next day on the way to the airport, I said to him, Rabbi Wein, I've been teaching in Denver since 1986. Over the years, which is now, eight years or so, we've developed many, many followers and many students. And many of them were people who did not go to shul, or there were people who went to synagogue or temple but found it empty. And I need to open up, there needs to be in Denver, I don't know where to send them. There was no shul at the time that was catering to the people that would come to study with me. And I said, I need to open up a shul that will speak to these people, make their time in shul meaningful, and get them to study more. I need you to recommend somebody from out there in the world of rabbis, somebody who is capable of doing that. He's sitting in the front seat and he looks at me and he says, Yaakov, it's you. And I laughed. I mean, I don't remember if I laughed, but I remember him. I said, Rabbi Wein, I've never thought in my life of being a rabbi. I was smicha, but I was teaching. That's what I had envisioned myself doing, which Baruch Hashem, I still do, although not as much as I did back then. But I said to him, besides that, I'll never be able to do it because there are two things in life that I absolutely do not want to do. One is being a pulpit rabbi, and the other one is fundraising. And he said, you'll do it. And he said, as Rabbi Goldberg alluded to, he actually, at that time, was working with Zev Wolfson in trying to get seed money to help start communities, Torah observant communities in different parts of the country. And I said to him, he said, what's with the fundraising? He said to me. And I said, well, if I'm going to be out here, then I need a place that I can able to rent, that I can have a place where people can come to daven and people can come to learn. And he said to me, well, how much do you think that'll be? So I said, I was still working for the yeshiva at the time, for quite a few years afterwards, and the yeshiva was still paying the overwhelming bulk of my salary. And I said, I don't have to worry so much about salary. The few extra $1,000 that I need, I could raise probably myself, but I need money for rent. Where am I going to get rent money? Right now, those of you who recall, I was teaching in a trailer over in Cook Park for 7 years. And I said, I have to move on. I'm not going to be able to start this in a trailer. So he said, how much do you think you're going to need? So at that time, Linda Kernis and family and Jerry, they were helping me try to look for a place where we'd be able to move as an educational center. Even this is before talk of a shul, which is what eventually happened. And I said to me, I probably need $30-something thousand a year to get started. So I need to pay rent. I need $25,000 a year. And he looked at me and he says, I'll get it for you. Do you know what that meant to a young rabbi, a kid out there who is successful, Baruch Hashem, in his teaching and making many friends, but to start a new venture and having at that time, the burden obviously grew greater and greater over the year, but to have a burden like that put on your shoulders, somebody who had never seriously raised any money before, and say, you need the rent, I'll cover it for you. Except that he didn't raise the $75,000 over 3 years, he raised $100,000. And over the next 3 years, from the Wolfson family, every month I received a check that helped cover the rent. Rabbi Wein, after that conversation, never spoke to me about it again. He dealt with Wolfson, and that was that. And I've thanked him many times publicly. And he also, in 1995, we started at the very end, high holidays, 95, we had our first minyan in the Shenango Street Shul, was given that name next to King Supers. In June of the following June of 96, we had our opening. We had our grand opening. Rabbi Wein came. Rabbi Wein spoke there. He was here afterwards. I don't remember when, but then in 2008, when we dedicated this building, he came and he spoke again. He spoke here. And then in 2000, and he was here for Shabbos at that time, and that was some Shabbos that we had with him. And then as recently as 2019, where he was, well into his 80s, he came, and he came to speak at a donor event, and he came to speak here. So he was here many times, and each time enthralled the people, inspired the people, encouraged the people, and made me all the more grateful to him for the great gifts that he has given me. I've been fortunate to have a number of great people in my life who I was fortunate to be able to call Rebbe. And the Mishnah in Avos says, Aseh lecha Rab. Every rabbi has to have a rabbi. Everybody has to have a Rab. And a Rab doesn't mean somebody's going to sit down and learn with them Gemara, although that's important too. There has to be somebody who gives the person direction, because a lot of times we're not subjective, or we simply don't know something. So there are halachic rabbanim. There are rabbis out there who I ask halachic questions of. But as I said before, there are just issues, questions in life where I feel that I need a clear vision. And I've had Rav Noach Weinberg, I've had Rabbi Yisachar Meyer, I've had Rav Moshe Shirkin, he should live and be well. And now, Baruch Hashem, I have Rabbi Yitzchak Berkowitz, Rosh Yeshiva Ve'eshat Torah. But for many years, many years, I turned to Rabbi Wein even until the end. And I'm grateful to him for what he did for me, what he did for our community, and what he did for Jews all over the world, because he made it clear that our job is that the Almighty should turn to us and say, Yisrael asher b'cho es pa'or. You are the Jewish people in whom I take pride, in whom I glorify myself. And that was something that he gave over very, very strongly. He excelled in so many different areas. Rabbi Goldberg didn't speak about any of them, but it was so masterful to think about how he managed to cover so many things, and he didn't stop. I heard him eulogize his second wife, an incredible second marriage, and he was in his 70s when he got married. He was in his early 80s, when his second wife died, and the relationship that he had with her, and what we learned from him was just amazing. So I'll close. A friend of mine was a student in his yeshiva, and about 8 or 9 years ago, this Rabbi Wein spent Shabbos in this city with this rabbi. In the car, my friend, he said now, it was an insensitive question. It was shortly after Rabbi Wein's second wife died, and he turned to Rabbi Wein and he said, "How's Rebbe feeling?" He said later, it was an insensitive question. What was he supposed to say? And he had children, Baruch Hashem, and grandchildren, but he was bereft. He was very, I myself, when I heard the eulogy, I was overwhelmed with emotion at the way he spoke about his wife and the way he eulogized her. And he said, there's no choice. They have to go on and keep accomplishing. If not, it's either that or death. And that's how he felt about life. If I keep on going on college, I'm trying to teach myself that lesson. My wife is trying to teach me that lesson, that until old age. And you got to keep on doing, you got to do for Hashem. That's why we're put here. That job of a Jew trying to live a life of bringing honor to Hashem never ends, as long as he's on this world. May we merit, as Rabbi Goldberg said, to learn from him, to learn from his knowledge, to learn from his behavior, to learn from his attitude, to learn from his Adam Lachavero, the way he treated other people so masterfully. And sometimes was able to diffuse a very difficult situation with a quick wit, which he had they call it a very dry humor. Even last week, I was listening, Rabbi Lehrfield had a personal interview with him, what, 1.5 years, 2 years ago, something like that. What? Exactly a year. So it was pretty close to the end. And he was so open, and they had mutual relatives. And you hear Rabbi Wein sort of talking in a very, very family way. It's a fascinating interview. Is it available on our website?
It's available on the Joy site.
It's available on the Joy site. We said we would send it out this week. We forgot to do that. Maybe we'll send it out. But he gave time to everyone. He loved the Jewish people, and he loved the God of the Jewish people. Yehizir Baruch, may his memory be a blessing. We can make it a blessing by emulating what he did. Thank you.